The Twin Peaks Conversations guest for January 2022 is Mark Givens, the author of a brand new nonfiction book, Murder at Teal'S Pond, which is about the 1908 Hazel Drew cold case that helped to inspire Twin Peaks. Only in writing this intro, by the way, did I realize that Murder at Teal'S Pond is a collaboration between a David and a Mark, just like Twin Peaks. So there's a fun note for you. We're going to be avoiding some of the speculation that the writers ultimately engage in the book in terms of who they believe might have killed Hazel Drew. I'll allow them to unfold that on the page, but we will dig into many other aspects of the text. The public conversation here on YouTube focuses almost exclusively on Murder at Teal'S Pond, and in the longer patron exclusive part 2 that we always do for Twin Peaks Conversations month to month, for the $5 a month patrons, we're going to continue discussing the book, digging more into it, along with some other topics like Mark's work on the Deer Meadow Radio podcast, Marilyn Monroe and the Kennedy conspiracy theories, the 1990 Twin Peaks parody on the show Wise Guy, and as always, questions about Twin Peaks Season 3 and a possible Season 4. That seems to be a recurring theme with all of these conversations when we get into that second half. Now, before that, an update on my recent work. I've just resumed an Olympic film series, which will be published every Wednesday on my site. It's written capsules on all of the century of documentaries on the winter and summer events, and eventually the Winter Games coming in February. That's why I've resumed this after pausing it last summer. Back in December, I returned to the Lost in Twin Peaks podcast to conclude season 1 with a week's worth of episodes and an illustrated companion on the finale. That podcast probably won't resume again until May with Firewalk with Me and then season 3. I'm going to skip ahead to cover those for their anniversaries this year. They both have big anniversaries in 2022. But I may be able to cover part of season 2 in March and April before that, so stay tuned. On the Lost in the Movies podcast, I recently discussed the film The Piano, Jane Campion's film, part of a little couple of films I'm covering of hers this winter. And on my Twin Peaks Cinema podcast, I launched the Small Town Blues series by comparing Twin Peaks to the 1940s Ronald Reagan film King's Row. My Mad Men viewing diary has concluded the first part of season 7 and just launched the second part, the final stretch of that show set in 1970. So these are written entries chronicling my first ever viewing of Mad Men that go up every Monday on lostinthemovies.com. I also made a holiday guest appearance on a special return episode of the Twin Peaks Unwrapped podcast in which we discussed the never-produced David Lynch screenplay Ronnie Rocket. So that was really interesting to get into. And finally, on Patreon, I compared the film Mysterious Skin to Twin Peaks, among other topics. Plus, all Lost in Twin Peaks episodes for 3 seasons have been made available to the $1 a month patrons. So there's been a lot of work that I've been up to in the past month. You can check all that out. Links on my site that are in the show notes. There's also one more Patreon episode that I just put up today for the 70th anniversary of this film on Dangerous Ground, which I compared to Twin Peaks, along again with some other topics in this podcast. That film also has some interesting similarities to what we're about to discuss, the Hazel Drew story as told in Murder at Teal'S Pond. Certainly a contrast between the city and the country present both that film and this story. So definitely want to check that out if you are becoming a patron or are already a patron and want some more material like this. Now let's rewind the clock to turn of the century New York, visiting the Taborton Woods and the city of Troy for the story of Hazel Drew. Welcome to Twin Peaks Conversations. This is going to be a little bit unusual for the discussions we've been having because so far for the first 5, I had people with sort of unrelated projects, like there might be some overlap in interest and subject matter. But Mark is actually coming on to talk about a book that we teased back in September when I had David Bushman on, talking about Murder at Teal'S Pond, the story of Hazel Drew, a murdered woman in the early 1900s whose story helped inspire Twin Peaks down the line. So I'm going to let Mark introduce that topic for those of you who did not hear that earlier conversation or maybe forgot, refresh your memories. And this time we're going to be able to get into the book much more in detail because now it's out. I've read it and there's so much to discuss here. This was a fantastic book. I enjoyed reading this so much. So I won't say any more about it, Mark. You set us up with this world.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, having David on earlier. It's great. Yeah, if you want a great overview, go find that previous episode because I'm sure Bushman nailed the overview. I always let him answer that question. He's not here today, however, so I'll do my best. This is 1908, upstate New York, out in the woods, out in area near a town called Sand Lake, which was outside of Albany, about 15, 20 miles. A young woman, at first they don't know how old she is. They actually think she's maybe in her 30s because the body is in bad shape, but the body is found in this location, this farmer's land, in a pond, colloquially known as TEAL'S Pond. That's the name of the farmer. These kids find the body. They get a local farmer. They help pull it out. Eventually, get the local authorities involved, the coroner. And eventually the body is identified as Hazel Drew, and she's not in her 30s. She's 20 years old, and they can't even identify the body at first. None of the locals, really know, have a clue as to what's going on. Eventually, they come to find out it's this 20-year-old girl named Hazel Drew who actually lives in Troy, New York. It's also about 15, 20 miles away from this scene of the crime where the body is found. She had some ties to the Sand Lake area. She at one time did live in the country when she was a child, but her family, for economic reasons, moved back and forth. So she was living in Troy at a pretty young age in the city. And at the age of 14, she actually moved out of her parents' home and started working as what they called a domestic servant. And she ended up working for these sort of powerful men in Troy. From here, all kinds of mysteries and questions arise. What was she doing out there? Obviously, why was she killed? How did she get out there? And the investigators started getting into her life, and that's the book. She's actually, I think, a quite complicated person. Sort of like, for Twin Peaks fans, like Laura, the two sides of her. She could be described by her friends and family as quiet, church going, stays at home, and on one hand, but then you find out she had all these relationships and men, boys with crushes on her and so forth. So if that sounds sort of familiar, that's how we came to this. It's not necessarily Agent Cooper, the Black Lodge, or those other things, but the core mystery, what Mark Frost took from this story that he heard as a story without all the facts of the case, which had kind of receded over time, and it had just more become like a folks, a local folk story, almost a ghost story about the girl, the dead body at the pond. And he had heard that from his grandmother as a boy because he would visit. His family had a summer home in this area. And his grandmother, a good storyteller, big surprise, Mark Frost's family. And this was one of the stories that stuck with him as a child. Years later, when him and David Lynch are in their coffee shop or wherever they had their infamous meetings, that for whatever reason during that conversation, this kind of sparked in his mind. So that's, and again, for Twin Peaks references, this is very much a Mark Frost connection. David Lynch probably would have no idea who Hazel Drew is at this point. So that's, without getting into any really of the questions or the mysteries or the details of the case, that's what this book is. And David and I both kind of came upon this story initially around the time when the new season of Twin Peaks was announced and coming back on the air. And that's when I had started my podcast, Dear Metal Radio, looking into Twin Peaks inspirations and things like that. David was writing a book on Twin Peaks FAQ, and had also uncovered this Hazel Drew story, this Hazel Drew inspiration.
It's a remarkable story, and the connections, I think, are really striking. I found your work through Dear Meadow, and I remember one of those very early episodes covering the Hazel Drew story right away. It was like a hook. I think you also had one looking at Marilyn Monroe and one looking at the Wise Guy show with its storyline, which I actually followed up on as well. So we'll talk about that at some point.
I think we covered a lot of the same ground.
We did. I mean, you were definitely an inspiration in that regard, and in some of these subjects that you explored. From the beginning for you, Hazel Drew was there, there was a real fascination there. What was the point where it became not just sort of a curious side subject, but I mean, eventually this was something that consumed years of your life.
Mhm.
And what was David Bushman's role, I guess, in sort of partnering up and making it into like a full-fledged media project
Yeah.
as it ended
I
up
think
being?
you just kind of answered yourself there. Bushman's probably the one, who who pushed the deals and the deadlines and that kind of thing. I could be happy sometimes just, digging into rabbit holes forever. So he was instrumental in that. He was writing a book at the time, so I think I spent more time on, initially looking into things. I think I had spoken to our one of our contacts up there already, Bob Moore, a historian up there in Sand Lake.
And you guys
Um,
had several visits there. I mean, quite a few over the
oh
years,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like you got to
definitely.
actually experience this world firsthand, and I think you evoke it beautifully in the book. I mean, I had no sense of these places. I guess a little bit of the community, the rural community, because of Mark Frost's
Hmm.
the interviews that David Bushman did with him, but certainly nothing about Troy and the the connections between the two worlds. I mean, what a fascinating
Uh,
social portrait of just
it was great.
all of these different threads connecting her and other people and each other and
Yeah,
everything.
well, just like you, I mean, I had no idea of Troy or Sand Lake or anything, and it's always when you think of if you're talking from Twin Peaks, you're thinking about Oregon and Washington and David Lynch's kind of influence. But I mean, you go up there and it feels like Twin Peaks. We spoke to lots of different people. There's a library up there in Troy that you can do a lot on the internet, but certain papers are only available in the library. We went to the Hall of Records or county clerk's office, I guess, and they unleashed us down in the basement, let us dig around there. We were largely unsuccessful in finding any official records. There was never an arrest in the case, so that I think kind of hampered that. It just kind of went away. If there wasn't a court case or anything like that, there was an inquest, but we never found anything on that. But yeah, I mean, it was great up there. It was one of the best parts of it was meeting like a community, really. The Twin Peaks community is like an online thing and is kind of similar up there. It's just people all interested in this case for one reason or another. We had relationships, I guess I would say, with two or three different historians who we would go back to, and they were great, always generous with their time. Bob Moore, who I mentioned, he's the Sand Lake historian. So again, it's like the tale of two cities. There's Sand Lake, and that was Bob Moore for us. And then in Troy, that was Kathy with the Troy Historical Society, Kathy Sheehan. Every time we went up there, practically, there would be a round table
Yeah, I was just gonna
discussion.
say, and you said you
Oh, there
might
were,
re-release Dear Meadow Radio with some
yeah,
of
I mean,
those
I have them.
discussions,
I'm
right?
just, yeah, I had the COVID, they're
Yeah,
there. I meant to kind of launch it with the book because it's not even a lot of work, it's just kind of doing an intro and putting them out there. So that's
yeah.
my hope. I think they're great. I mean, if you're into the book,
And so many of the
uh,
same people you were saying in the book still, I mean, not the literally the same people, but their descendants still live up there and remember the times and some things. I
yeah,
mean, I know you said
yeah,
they're not as sort of disconnected from the world as maybe they were back then, but it's still sort of remote.
I think everyone has the internet, and it's not like quite how it was in the early 20th century. But there's that, they have more. I mean, I just moved from the city to the sub, it's just a different
Yeah.
space thing, even, if you're crowded up with people all the time, kind of in a city setting versus living out on Taborton Mountain and you have this area of the mountain to yourself. And when a car goes by, you take a look, who's that, making a turn in my driveway. So that's just, that's not in the book, or it hopefully is in some sense, but you just get that difference of feeling. And it's not saying one's better. I think there's pros and cons on both. The people up there are great.
It's interesting too, the sort of coalescence of forces here because you guys were coming in, you had eventually a book deal, you had connection. I mean, obviously, some of them have connections, some of them are Mark Frost friends, but you had that sort of Twin Peaks connection and all of that. And on the other hand, though, they the legend had, and some of the facts, I assume, had been somewhat kept alive in that area, right? Like there were people who were really obsessed with this case.
It really had faded for the most part.
Interesting.
On some sort of anniversary, not that long ago,
Yeah.
one of the local papers somehow resurrected this and reprinted their articles at the time.
Oh,
And that
interesting.
sort of generated some local interest. So by the time David and I kind of uncovered things, there were sort of people looking into it, but they didn't know about the Twin Peaks connection. But to
Interesting.
your question, a lot of it had faded. We were kind of at the past the point of people who would have really remembered
Oh,
going
yeah.
through it at all, you know. So it would be more our best we could do was their children. For example, we spoke to the grandchildren of the farmer where the pond, Teal's Pond, the
Hmm.
titular Teal's Pond. Three of them actually, they were cousins. Kenny Teal, I remember specifically as a great. He was like a Twin Peaks character. We have him on around, you know, just he's like I don't know 70, 80 years old, but still had that spark, and he's flirting with his wife and uh, that kind of thing. So they would remember some stories from their parents. You know what I mean? But that's not, you know, you could almost tell, you could see where by looking into the newspapers and the facts, which they didn't know at all, you could see where the kind of urban legends started to
Yeah.
grow, and which is also interesting. You know, we at some point discuss, you know, getting that more into the story, like our investigations, which I guess if I get the podcast going would kind of take that role.
And the Taperton Mountains, I feel like, or that just that area, was it South Lake and some of the town she grew up in? What was the
Mhm.
name of that one? Post
That
Kill,
was a
yeah.
kill.
With that rural small town area, it feels like maybe I'm wrong about this, but the impression I got from your book is like this was probably one of the biggest things that ever happened there. Um, with Troy, on the other hand, I mean that city from, and I knew nothing about it again before reading this. That's full, even in just that little era, full of all these stories where this was sort of just
Mhm.
one of many cases and
Yep.
odd connections and things going on behind the scenes. It's like so sort of splitting between those two worlds and the role that the Hazel Drew case plays in each, I thought was fascinating. And
Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, Troy, you're right. They were, I think, obsessed with this for the couple of weeks, but you're right. The
yeah,
papers kind of moved on, and they had famous gangsters and other murders and the veiled mistress and all
yeah, like
kinds of stuff going on in Troy. Yeah, that's a great observation.
they've
And
had
I
documentaries and books written that you guys reference in there about like a
yeah,
madam
well,
and
what's
stuff like
the
that.
yeah, Main Faye is another famous figure, you know, this sort of she ran brothels, one of these notorious figures, kind of cult figures.
Right.
But if you remember in the story, it's kind of late in the investigation. There was
Yeah.
even out in the woods, there was a club of some sort, and they
Yeah.
suspected there were sex orgies and all, you
Yeah.
know,
At the
and
camp and all of that. That's,
yeah, and
yeah.
that reminded me of it also. But you're right, there was one in Troy, and you're right when you say this would have been a big deal in Sand Lake. Definitely, it wasn't a big city at all. But in the course of our research, it was mainly from this guy we were lucky enough to talk to. It took a while, but he was the one guy who Mark Frost knew. Kind of their families knew each other. His name was John Walsh. I think, like I said, Mark Frost knew this as a story when he was a kid, and then I think when they were starting Twin Peaks, then he did kind of out of curiosity or whatever, just go look into it. You know, not to this level. He does read the book and you know graciously provided the forward, but he did look into it to confirm it. And when he was doing that, he talked a lot with this guy John Walsh. You know, that's the start of Twin Peaks, right? The body being found, and you know what the hell's going on here, and that's really the start that he took from this. All the
Yeah.
details he didn't really know or use. It's weird when you go through it that you
Yeah.
can make connections like, oh, this is clearly, you know, where he got this guy from, but all coincidences really.
Yeah, that part's amazing. Somebody has got to get this book into the hands of Grail Marcus, the I guess he's primarily a rock critic, but the writer. Have you
Okay.
ever read his book? he wrote a book of essays around 2006, like right before Twin Peaks kind of started to make a comeback. Like I feel like that was when it was at its lowest ebb culturally.
Right.
But he
Hmm.
devotes an entire chapter to Twin Peaks, as specifically like the anchor of it is Cheryl Lee's performance in Fire Walk with Me. But I think it's called like Cheryl Lee's Face or something like that. Like he just goes on these amazing riffs, sometimes hard to follow because he kind of, he has a way of sort of indulging metaphors and going on and on. Like I really enjoy it, but it's called The Shape of Things to Come, book of essays from around that time. And I don't think anybody has done better work on the Twin Peaks as like a piece of Americana and its connection to all
Hmm.
these other myths and stuff. But the things that made me think of that book while reading this were, first of all, he talks about these like folk songs about a man going for a walk with a lover and then hitting her over the head and like throwing her in the water and stuff and killing her, and just that sort of history of like small town murders and that type of thing. And then the other aspect of it is he talks about the dichotomy within Twin Peaks itself, where even though it's this small town, it has like sort of two extremes in it, especially at day and at night. And he calls them the Sylvan Village and the Noir City. And in this book, not so much in the town, but between the town and countryside and the city of Troy on the other, you have exactly that dynamic. I mean, he talks a lot about political corruption and the bosses and all this stuff. And reading the book, I was just like, oh my God, this is like, it's almost more Twin Peaks than Twin Peaks is when you think about
Wow.
it in those types of terms. So yeah, somehow somebody, if they could, I would love to hear him just riff on this history, because it almost
Hmm.
feels like he talked about it in there, but not by name, because I don't think he
Interesting.
knew
That
this.
is
I
interesting.
don't know what he writes for now or what, but
Mhm.
yeah, no, it's
It,
if I
I
feel like
guess
this is right up his alley.
you said it came out in the what, mid 2000s. That's kind of the, I guess, the right time to let everything settle and come up with a holistic look at things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a
Really
great.
for the
It goes
original
into
stuff.
Lincoln, it goes into Allen Ginsberg and Howe and Kansas and all this stuff. Like he just kind of, it's a very sort of stream of consciousness essay,
Interesting.
book of essays. But yeah, check it out. And I would say get this. But yeah, I just wanted to bring up that Sylvan Village Noir City thing, because it's that dichotomy is so striking in this book,
Yeah,
where it's
yeah,
almost like
definitely.
you took the two parts of Twin Peaks and separate. I mean, it was real, so you didn't actually do this, but like took the two parts and almost separated them out into physically different locations that she's bouncing between.
Yeah, no, and yeah, I mean, we saw that. It's weird. The story was just kind of there, We
Yeah.
didn't we didn't really have to do that, but it is definitely striking, the two sides. And her body's found here. She lived here. She grew up here, but then she moved here. So she definitely moved between two worlds and was pretty comfortable, and wasn't like, I'm leaving this behind even. She was a social creature, and these two worlds definitely informed her life, her character, everything. When I first came upon this, doing Deer Meadow Radio, well, before the idea of the book, or this could be a book, but I mean, it seemed like, obviously it inspired Mark Frost to do a TV show. So I could see it very cinematically. And at some point, that part became clear to me too. It's almost like you could do a season without getting any spoilers and all this, but kind of early on there, if you follow the book and the investigation, it's more on the Sand Lake side, at least in terms of where the suspects are coming from. And this is where her body was found. Her uncle lives near the area. There's some good suspects out there. And the more you go on, and again, I'll trail off here, but I think the Troy side is equally interesting in terms of her life and, who killed her, I think. It's not just Sand Lake. So you could almost do a season. There'd be overlap and back and forth, but the emphasis would be kind of on that early part of the investigation. And then if you followed it up on, it would actually, I guess, more into our solution without, again, giving too much away. But we got into things that weren't covered in the investigation, but that were now definitely, and I guess even then part of the story, and a lot of that is more of the Troy side of things, where she lived and worked and all that. She as a child she lived in the country and she would return there to visit, but she really grew up and became a woman in Troy. So yeah,
Yeah.
definitely interesting dichotomy.
Let's talk a little bit about Hazel Drew as a person, because I think that she's such an interesting centerpiece to the book, where it's like we get because of the nature of it, because you're going back and digging up this stuff, we get a kind of a Laura Palmer of the show in a way, where we're seeing her through all these different eyes and these different capacities. But of course, just because of the fact you can't take a time machine and go talk to Hazel Drew, in which case, she wouldn't have been murdered anyways, hopefully. Speaking of,
Mm.
time travel in Twin Peaks and trying to prevent murders. But, so you can't get that sort of inside story. So we never get the fire walk with me, Hazel Drew. We can only see her, or the secret diary of Laura Palmer version of Hazel Drew. It's, we're seeing her almost entirely through other people's eyes, but
Mhm.
we're still getting that shape of this fascinating character, and trying to kind of give her life. So can you talk about both her, what you learned about her, and also just the process of how you went about sort of reconstructing who this person was?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. It is the book really, if you strip it down, it is about Hazel, because even if you're just focused on the mystery, the circumstances of her death and how she was found, there's nothing there. There was no oh, here's the bloody whatever. So we as the authors and the investigators at the time had to focus on who she was, and
Mm.
her connections in life, and think about why people get killed. And it's there's relationships and love and money and things like that. So
And you say at one
um
point, you kind of make the same distinction that I know I have many people have made about Laura Palmer, which is you start off by asking who killed Hazel Drew, and it becomes who was Hazel Drew.
yeah, that's very Twin Peaks. Yeah, that's right. That's how the show played out. And you meet, and I think that is a similar thing between Twin Peaks and this story, or how we presented it. You're right. The way you get to know her is through Aunt Minnie, and all, and her uncle Will, and her parents, and her friend Carrie, and her boyfriends, and all these people who give you a little piece of her, and then you have to do some use your discretion. Is this valid? Or what is their bias and motivation? You get to a character like Aunt Minnie, who was a close confidant to Hazel, years older than her. She was in her mid 30s, I think. But just that knew a lot, but wouldn't tell investigators a lot of things purposely. I think, and it's kind of maybe we can have a follow-up. Joel, I think we talked a little bit about this at some point about the solution, and get David on here, because there were some areas where we did not agree.
Interesting. Okay.
um, yeah, and you had to, but for the book, the way we structured it, it's not two authors, it's or two voices, it's
Yeah.
one. So we had to come to a consensus. I think he's a little harder on Aunt Minnie than I would be, in terms of her motivations. So she
Mm.
didn't share things with the detectives, and you're like, well, why isn't she? David's like, why isn't she telling them everything if she, cares about her niece and wants to solve the crime? But she did kept saying, like, it's no good dragging people's. She was very protective of Hazel and her family, and presumably other people. So I came down on that, as she knew things about Hazel's relationships and so forth, that she didn't want to feed the tabloids, which were exploding at the time.
Yeah.
Anybody connected to Hazel was in the headline. So I saw Aunt Minnie as very weird and very gossipy and all these kinds of things, but probably protective of Hazel in that sense. So, these aren't the difference between analyzing this and Twin Peaks is, these are real people.
Yeah.
Like, who are you? Who am I? Am I a good person? I don't. And I take that approach with Hazel. So I very nuanced about who she is, and I guess there may be some difference in my opinion too about does she have any culpability? Was she doing something wrong? And I just really saw no evidence of that. She may have been in a relationship. She may have done something in that sense because she had this outgoing personality, had all these relationships, a social creature. And in 1908, maybe that didn't, there were some problems with that, with her not fitting into maybe a certain structure. And maybe that played a role in getting her killed. But to my mind, she's not culpable for that, for the problems with the times. So yeah, who is Hazel? It seems like she's a contradiction. They put her under a microscope after she was killed, and you do get these contradictions, but that's how people are. I think you have to remember that she's not Laura Palmer, written to do this for dramatic effect. I mean, this is just her living her day-to-day life. They found out, I think this is another one me and David disagree upon, so he's not really here to defend himself, but he's probably on the side of most people I've heard on this side. But she apparently, was always kind of well dressed, and here she is, a domestic servant, but she would have specially tailored clothes, and was very interested in that. So of course, the tabloids at the time and people even today are like, well, that could be something. How's she getting this money? That maybe there's something going on there. And maybe she was good with her money and bought nice clothes. It's possible. I talked to a historian, and maybe we'll get this released if it was recorded. And I asked her about this from Troy at the time. And she said, well, she lived with the people she worked with, so she's not paying room and board or food or anything. She is making money, so if that's what she wanted to spend it on, then she bought some nice clothes, in my view. I could be wrong. That could be. There are so many unanswered questions, and it's a matter of finding which one is important. And in my opinion, that did not seem like an important one to me, that she had clothes that were nicer than you expected. You know what I mean? You can in Twin Peaks, you could make that connection, and here's the motive and here's the blah, blah, blah. But in real life, you find out it's not like that.
There's also a breakthrough in the case, to the extent we can. We'll talk about that in a moment, just the sort of fascinating frustrations of how this case unfolded. But there is a breakthrough, and then, dead end, like all of them, where they find a chest full of letters to Hazel. And so they're able to see she had many admirers. She had some secrets that she was hiding from people. There's even like a scrap of paper where she wrote a name repeatedly, which you guys kind of dive into in interesting ways. Now, I assume you didn't, that those are out of circuit, that those were destroyed or disappeared at some point, right? Like you didn't get to look at those, so you only had the reporters.
Yeah, for that.
Secondhand.
There was no like material evidence that remained after all this time. We looked and looked and talked to people, and there were fires and floods, and things were moved, and we couldn't ever definitively, in my mind, prove that kind of stuff, or the investigators' notes or anything, the inquest records, didn't exist. But we were not, the only thing after like literally years of asking, that we were able to track down that was sort of like a real relic like that of the time, was the out in Sand Lake, the funeral home. The descendants of that had kept some of the old books, and there was like an entry for Hazel's, but in terms of our investigation, I think that didn't really help us at all. So
interesting. Yeah,
that was frustrating. Not to be able to find anything really. That would be great if that somehow turned up. But yeah.
Well, something that's very striking about the book is that it has that incredible similarity. Like I said, almost more Twin Peaks than Twin Peaks in terms of the location. She's killed out in the woods at this lake. It's like, then there's also the small town and its social dynamic. There's the two mountains in the area. Then there's the city, which is like Twin Peaks' nightlife and all the intricate political connections. So there's that. The other element that I was talking about, 3 elements to Twin Peaks. The other element, Laura Palmer, obviously, as we've discussed. Hazel Drew, just some, obviously some differences. I think the impression you get is she was probably a happier person day to day than Laura Palmer was. until
Mhm.
the end, or at least that's the impression that, um, you know, obviously the people had different impressions of her, but it seems like everybody kind of shared the idea that she was optimistic and outgoing and looking forward to life. And there wasn't, she didn't
Yeah, there's
necessarily
no,
have this,
we all know Laura's her, the
of
tragedy
course,
with her
yeah.
father in it. So yeah, nothing like that. She had, not an ideal childhood in the sense that
No,
her
no,
father
not at
had
all.
problems with employment and moving around. But yeah, she definitely seemed like a happy person,
And
you
the
know.
last time she's ever seen, just what a striking image too. I couldn't get this out of my head. Is like
Mm.
she's picking berries by the road somewhere where she had kind of grown up and seems very absorbed and happy in this. And you have no idea how she got out there, why she's there. It's such a strange place for her to be when she's living in Troy, just standing on the side of this
Mhm.
country road picking berries. And that's the last time anyone sees her alive.
She was, also a little bit what we talked about earlier, but completely dressed like she was out for a big night on the
Yeah.
town, out on this country road,
Yeah.
that
What a strange, it's like the whole of her life summed up in like one image, you know?
Mm, yeah, really.
So we're going to shift a little bit into the Patreon exclusive mode. But before we do that, I want you to let people know where they can find this book, the best way to get it, and also your own work, your archives, and everything like that with Deer Meadow Radio. And so just sort of give people that information so that they have somewhere
Yeah.
to take it.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, the book is available now. I think it's available as of January 1st, Murder at Teal's Pond. Looking at it, Hazel Drew and the Mystery That Inspired Twin Peaks. You can get it anywhere that you get your books. In this day and age, I think that's, at least from my experience, primarily online. So the usual big bookstores will have it. In terms of in brick and mortar and so forth, I think that does vary, but it can be ordered certainly. But if you have a favorite online resource you use, I would use that. It's definitely available. It's hardback, paperback, ebook, and there's an audio also. The Deer Meadow Radio stuff, which is a little older now. It's my podcast about Twin Peaks when it was coming back, but it was designed to, kind of be evergreen in the sense that it wasn't following this week's episode or anything. It was, I don't know, Joel, how do I describe it? Like the little essays or on topics, kind of like Joel does now,
Well,
or Joel also does.
I love the title of Dear Meadow Radio because I feel like that sort of evoked, like you almost have like, not to compare you to sort of his style of delivery or necessarily all the things he says, but sort of that Dr. Jacoby out in the woods, or Dr. Amp, I guess, out in the
Yeah.
woods style, where it's just you kind of talking and going on these deep dives
My
and
rants.
sort of exploring these other avenues in a way that I feel like more sort of co-hosted podcasts don't quite like
That's
it's
a good
more of
point.
like a journey off into the weeds,
That's funny.
which I really
I never
enjoy.
made that connection,
And
but
if,
that
yeah,
is
it
good.
feels like a
That's
radio
funny.
thing, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Deer Meadow Radio came before Dr. Jacoby's
That's true. You
podcast.
did. Yeah,
I'll
maybe
put that
that
out there.
influenced him.
Yeah, so Deer Meadow Radio, just search it on Yahoo. There's a podcast on iTunes. There's a Facebook group. My Twitter account is Deer Meadow Radio, and there's an email, deermeadowradio@gmail.com. There's about, if you're a Twin Peaks fan, there's about, I don't know, 17 episodes maybe I ended up on. I interviewed Mark Frost, Harley Payton, weird interviews too. I tried to answer or ask weird questions that they didn't get all in other places. Way too much coverage of the Twin Peaks Access Guide, for example. It was very ambitious. I guess this is part of our other conversations, but Deer Meadow Radio is basically the keyword. So your favorite social media thing will turn some things up. You can check it out if you're interested.
So there's the town, there's Laura, and then the third element of Twin Peaks is Agent Cooper. And what's striking about this book is there is no Agent Cooper. There is no one coming in except maybe you guys after the fact, coming in to kind of sweep the thing. I think there's one person who wants to play that role, in some ways maybe does. We're going to pause there if you want to find out who I'm talking about in this book that I think is a quasi, maybe imagining themselves to be Cooper type character. check out that second part on Patreon for $5 a month. You get access to the second half of this and all the other Twin Peaks conversations so far and going forward. And as mentioned at the outset, you can find all of my work archived and continuing on lostinthemovies.com. So thanks for listening. Make sure you check out those links below for to purchase this book. Really highly recommended. It's so fascinating, this whole story. I think you got a taste of it here. And also to follow for the second half of this conversation on Patreon. Link will be below as well.